Now that we understand aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply, let's look at our individual shifts. So starting off with, we have four markets in equilibrium. And we'll begin by looking at what happens when we increase aggregate demand. When we increase the aggregate demand curve, we are going to call this aggregate demand sub 1. Okay, aggregate demand sub 1. Now, if we look at where our new aggregate demand curve intersects with our existing aggregate supply curve, we can see that the price level has gone up for goods and services, but there are more goods and services available to be bought and sold. So for our solution box, we'll say that there's an increase in the price level, and we are definitely in equilibrium, and there's an increase in real gross domestic product. Okay, so that's our solution, that there's an increase in the price level, so there's going to be some inflation. However, the inflation is going to be offset, hopefully, in the eye of the consumer because there are more goods and services available. Okay, so for the second one, let's say what happens to the economy when there's a reduction in aggregate demand. So when aggregate demand falls, we'll call this aggregate demand 1, we see that our new aggregate demand intersects our existing supply curve and results in a decrease in the price level and also lower amount of goods and services available. So we do have a reduction in the price level, which a lot of people think is really good. However, deflation can be just as bad, if not worse, as inflation. So there's deflation, there's a reduction in the price level, and at the same time, there's a reduction in the amount of real GDP available. Okay, so both of these markets are, however, in equilibrium. So there's a reduction in the amount of GDP and a reduction in the price level. Now let's look at the supply curves. Let's say that we are going to have an increase in the supply of domestically produced goods and services. So we have our short-run aggregate supply curve that's going to shift to the right, so short-run aggregate supply, and we have an increase in the amount of goods and services that are available. However, we have a lower price. So this situation is actually really good. Price goes down and quantity of real GDP has moved up. So there's a reduction in the price level, and at the same time there is an increase in real GDP. Okay, and this market is also still in equilibrium. So we will put our square around that for our solution, saying that the price level has gone down and real GDP has gone up. So our last shift, let's see what happens when there's a reduction in the short-run aggregate supply curve, causing it to shift back and to the left. Okay, when the aggregate supply curve shifts back into the left, we will call this short-run aggregate supply sub 1. We see that the new short-run aggregate supply curve intersects with our existing aggregate demand curve, causing the price level to go up, an increase in the price level, and a reduction in the amount of goods and services that are available. So we see that there is inflation, so there's the price level increasing, so inflation, along with a reduction in real GDP. Okay, this is also known as stagflation. So when we look at these four graphs, let's take a minute and look at these four graphs. We can find out a lot about what's going on with the economy in terms of unemployment. Well, in this graph, when real GDP goes up, and in this graph, when real GDP goes up, we know that here unemployment is going down. Okay, we have more people working, producing this GDP. Over here, where we have a reduction in GDP, we know that unemployment is going up. So now if we were to look at these graphs and say this is graph 1, this is graph 2, this is graph 3, and we'll call this one graph 4, which of these graphs is the worst for the economy? Well, we can probably guess that it's going to be graph number 2 and graph number 4, one of these. And especially if they hit at the same time, where there's a reduction in aggregate demand and a reduction in aggregate supply, when they definitely can both impact the economy at the same time. That would cause GDP to go significantly down, and our price level would obviously be uncertain, because if the change in aggregate demand is greater, it's going to cause the price level to come down. If the change in aggregate supply is greater, it's going to cause the price level to go up. So we wouldn't be able to predict what's going to happen with inflation or deflation, but the reduction in GDP would definitely hurt our economy significantly. This graph up here with the reduction of aggregate demand, this is one of the main graphs that we look at for the Great Depression. There was a decrease in short-run aggregate supply curve, but what started a lot of the problems that we had was the reduction in aggregate demand. So demand side reduction in GDP is definitely something that can hurt the economy very drastically. If we have too few goods, we know that anytime that we have too few goods, which is graph number 4, on the supply side, this will cause inflation. We learned before that there are two things that cause inflation. The increase in, let me just get that darker for you. The increase in printing money, so too much money chasing too few goods. This is when there are too few goods. All right, so these are our 4 different shifts individually. Just like individual demand and individual supply, oftentimes we'll see 2 shifts together. So make sure that you understand why sometimes we cannot predict either the price level or what's going to happen to real GDP.